Thanks for coming to our talk, everyone. We will talk about full disk encryption and the realities of secure storage on mobile devices. I'm Daniel Mayer. I'm a principal consultant with the nccgroup based out of Chicago. I'm more of an iOS guy from experience, and I've written a tool which some of you have maybe used called IDB, which is used for iOS pen testing. And I give this talk together with Drew Suarez.
That's right. I'm Drew. I'm a senior security consultant with NCC, as well as a research director. And I'm part of the CyanogenMod project. I built the wiki for the device exploits and instructions on how to use. I also port to new devices or unloved devices.
Right, so just in case you're not familiar, NCC Group is a consultancy, but we also do software escrow and testing domain services. They're based in the UK, but we are all from the US actually. All right, so we give a brief introduction to the topic first, and then we will talk about iOS and Android separate, starting with the iOS side and talking about which secure storage facilities there are, if there's any gaps, and how you can use them properly. And then we'll switch over to Android and see how Android compares to that, and show you how the entire boot chain and everything is actually really relevant for secure storage. And we give you a demo of an exploit we have developed to show you how failure to do so will result in disasters potentially, and then give a summary in the end. So what makes apps special? So everybody knows that mobile apps or mobile phones seem to be the primary way we use the internet these days. And if you look at how people use the mobile devices, there's actually the majority of people are using apps on the mobile devices, and they don't use the mobile web as much. And the problem with this is that if you're thinking from a company standpoint or from a privacy standpoint, traditionally all your data is somewhere in your server, somewhere where it's contained and you can put tight controls on it. But as soon as you put data on the mobile device, it's very difficult to enforce any controls anymore because it's being carried around everywhere. You don't have access to control the network very well. Even with mobile device management, this is still not an easy problem to solve necessarily. So, and why is this a problem? Well, there's three challenges which come based on that, which we identified. The first one is that since devices are being carried around, they're being lost or stolen very often. Here's some numbers from the US. There's 1.4 million phones lost in 2013 and 3.1 million phones stolen. While not all of those may actually go after the data on there, it may definitely not be in your best interest to get your data lost by just getting the phone lost or stolen. So if you need to protect it on the device somehow, but at the same time, we obviously need to enable people to use it and have data accessible on those devices. So we have either locally cached data from an application, which we need to have accessible offline or somewhere to get quicker access to, or at the very least, there's some sort of access token or credentials which are cached so that you don't have to relog into every service every time you open an app. Now, when we do those two things, we also have to keep in mind that users need to be able to do this in a more or less convenient way, because otherwise they will either not use the system or they will rebel against us as IT people. So if we make it too complicated to get access to the data, then we may end up with like a usability nightmare like this one. I don't know if you can read it. And then Drew will talk about a bit more about what it means to secure data.
All right, so everyone's heard there's no such thing as absolute security, but we're interested in finding out who we're concerned about in terms of the data on our devices and who we're concerned about looking at, accessing it and that sort of thing. So if we go through some of the actors here, we have remote actor, somebody who will connect to your device remotely. Coffee shop attacker, somebody who maybe sets up a Wi-Fi hotspot of their own or takes over a poorly secured one in an area and wants to snoop on poorly secured TLS traffic. We have the casual thief who probably doesn't care about the data on your phone at all. He probably just wants the hardware to flip and sell to somebody. We move to targeted attacks, which require a lot of time and effort and target a very specific person and their device most likely. And then we have nation states, which have a much larger budget and time in order to craft an attack against a particular user. So if we kind of put these on a graph of the security effort to defend against as well as the sophistication needed for these attacks, you can kind of see here, obviously the coffee shop attacker is very easy to do and very unsophisticated attack. We move all the way up to nation states. So we talk a little bit more in depth now about mobile data security. And a quick word on full disk encryption. This will, both of these models sort of transparently decrypt the data when it's needed for reading, and will transparently encrypt the data for writing when it's done. And really, when we talk about full disk encryption, the protection is when the device is off and the key is no longer resident in memory. Or as Daniel will talk about a little more on iOS, there's some more flexibility here, but we need more fine-grained control than this. And so I'll let Daniel introduce those concepts for iOS here.
Thanks. So iOS, if we look at iOS, the core advantage which we have here is that Apple controls both hardware and software. So they can build additional hardware support for security features such as the secure enclave and other parts, Touch ID and so on. And they can right away build software which is interfacing with that and can use those features right away. As we'll see later on Android, it's a little bit more complicated on that side. And what that allows Apple to do is that they have a boot chain which is signed from the ground up. So whenever the device starts booting, the bootloader checks that the next stage bootloader and everything coming forward is actually signed by Apple CA. And then there is no code which can be ejected or no modification which can be made without being detected. And in addition to that, once the operating system is running, if you install updates, they also have to be signed by Apple in order to update the system and get the latest security fixes. One thing which annoys people potentially is that you cannot do downgrades, but the reason for not having downgrades is that they claimed, at least the reason which they are putting out there is that you don't lose security features along the way. So if you had a certain degree of security, they don't want people to revert back. So they have everybody on the latest version can take advantage of all the latest features and bug fixes potentially. So from a security standpoint, that may actually be a good thing. Then the code running on the operating system is also signed. So again, here it's very hard to get code on an iOS device which is not signed, especially if it's not jailbroken. I talk about that in a second. So everything which is running on the device is somewhat trusted or comes from a source where it's known where it's coming from. Now, if you move over to encryption, if you think about encrypting something, you have to have something which is not stored on the device. If you were just simply to encrypt data on the device and you have a key, you need to put the key somewhere. And if you store the key on the device, then we're basically back where we started with our problem. So the way this works on most devices and most systems is that you derive a key from a passcode. So the user types in a passcode, and then there's a cryptographic key being derived from that passcode, which is then used to encrypt data. And you can, if you lock the device, you can wipe that key from memory, and then the data is not accessible anymore. So you kind of move from having the full disk encryption paradigm where you have data always accessible when the device is on to something where it's protected until you unlock the device, actually. The problem with this is that users are, because of usability reasons, prone to choose really weak passcodes, and then you have the problem that you can do offline attacks. So you can copy data off the device, brute force a PIN number there, and then you would be able to bypass this mechanism. So one way how to secure or protect against this is to leverage hardware. And there is a hardware root of trust, it's a secure enclave, which is in all latest iOS devices. And they can be used to hold an encryption key, or it does hold an encryption key in hardware, and every encryption decryption operation has to go through that piece of hardware in order to succeed. And there's no way to read that key off the device. So if you don't perform the operation on the device itself, then there's no way to get that key out and do an offline attack. So it more or less limits you to doing a brute force attack on the device. And with that, you have hardware controls which can prevent you from doing this and lock you or delete the entire key after a certain amount of time or attempts. So let's see how this ties into the features which iOS provides for developers to secure data. So everything which is stored on every user data stored on the device on iOS is encrypted. It's encrypted with a file key which is specific to each file, and that file key is stored with the metadata on the file system. Now, as I just mentioned, this doesn't really help us much because if it does store the key on the file system, encryption doesn't really help us. So what comes in play here is the hardware key, which ties this piece of data to the hardware. There's the hardware key, which is burned into the chip on manufacturing time, which is only on the device. And that key is used to encrypt the file system key. I will talk about the role of that key in a second. And then that file system key is used to encrypt the file key. So now we have all the files being tied to the device, and you can't decrypt them off the device. But if you get access to it, you can still just perform any encryption decryption operation as you'd like. So in order to prevent that, we tie in the passcode. On an iOS, we have over here this is actually really poorly visible. This is supposed to be a passcode screen. And so from this, we are deriving the passcode key using a key derivation function. And then that passcode key is used combined with the hardware key to get additional encryption keys, about which I will talk in a second. And then those keys are used to encrypt the actual file keys which are stored on the file system. So now we're in a position where we have something which is coming from the user, which is not stored on the device, and whenever the user locks the device, is not actually on there, and something which is tied to hardware so that we cannot do offline attacks and encrypt data. And we'll talk about in a second how you can get more fine-grained control. So the file system key up there is actually just used so that you can quickly wipe a device. If you want to wipe the device here, you can just blow that key away, and then you don't have access to any of the data on the device anymore. So you don't have to worry about wiping every single file key or doing things like that. So let's look at the class keys a little bit more. If I split these up into different parts here, we see that we have the file protection classes, as they are called. The first one is NS file protection none, which is only tied to the hardware, but it's not incorporating the key material from the passcode at all. And the other two are using both. They're tied into the hardware and they're tied into the passcode key. So those are used to protect data in the first instance until first user authentication, which is equivalent to full disk encryption. So when you turn on the device, it will ask you for the passcode the first time. Till you enter the passcode the first time, data will stay encrypted, but once you unlock the device, the key will remain in memory and it will be accessible. Well, the second one, the NS file protection complete, actually wipes the key every time you lock the device from memory, and it gives you a much stronger protection till you actually use the data after unlocking the phone. So as a developer, you have the option of choosing these, and obviously for most cases you would like to choose the NS file protection complete one so that you can protect data. The only downside is that you can't use that for background operations. If you have data which you need to be accessible when you have your phone locked to do background jobs, then you can't protect it with this unless you can hold that data in memory while you're running. So now we talked about the file encryption. There's a second mechanism on iOS, which is the iOS keychain, which you probably heard about. This is like a structured data storage where you can store lists of data, arrays of data, dictionaries, and things like that. And internally, this lives in a SQLite database, which is stored on the file system simply. And the interesting thing here is that the database is not encrypted as a whole, but every row in the database is encrypted. So you as a user can, as a developer, when you store data in the keychain, you can choose how you want it to be encrypted, and you can choose which protection you would like to have. I will talk in a second which classes are there, but the main problem with the keychain is that it never gets deleted. So if you store something, let's say using a certain application, you entering username and password, and that app stores the username and password in the keychain. You uninstall the app, the data is still in the keychain. If you reinstall the app, it may just pick it back up and continue using it. But if it didn't protect it properly and you just sell your phone in the future and you don't wipe it properly, then somebody else may get all your credentials or all your secret data which is stored in there. So if you look at the different options for storing data in the keychain, they're very much equivalent to what we've seen for the file system. There's NS file protection none, which we've talked about, which is not no encryption based on the passcode. And then and for the keychain, they somehow inverted all the namings, so they're maybe a bit easier to understand. It's always accessible always, or it is accessible after first unlock, or accessible when unlocked. And that's basically equivalent to what we just talked about for files. And then the last step is it is accessible when passcode set. And that means that you have to have a passcode on the device in order to store data with this setting. So if you're a developer and you want to store data in the keychain, you may not know if a user has a passcode on their device. So if they don't have a passcode, even if you use the when unlocked setting, there is no passcode to take advantage of, so the data would still be always accessible. And in order to give the developer some sort of way to say, well, we only want to store it if we can actually do so securely, there's the option when passcode set. And if you use that, if there's no passcode, it will just refuse to store the data. So you can use that to verify whether there is a passcode on the device or not. And that has just been introduced in iOS 8. So as I hinted on, we may wonder why are there all these different classes and why don't we always protect data till unlock or even stronger? Well, the reason is that some data just must be accessible at all times. So if you think about always, if you look at the default apps which are on the phone, there's a lot of them which are always accessible, because when you turn on your phone, you expect to get phone calls, or you expect that you can locate your phone if you lost it. So data related to that needs to be always accessible, even if you never unlock the device. Then there's other data which we can protect a bit more strictly, Wi-Fi credentials or email credentials or your Facebook credentials, things like that. Those are by default protected until first unlock. So if you start up the phone, you will not be able to use those services in the background until you unlock the phone at least once to unlock the data for it. And then even more other things, such as the home sharing or Safari or iTunes backups, all of those are protected even stronger till when unlocked, because you don't need to have your Safari passwords available in the background because you're not using Safari. So you can protect those more strictly. And you can use the same kind of thinking for your own apps or for apps which you're looking at. Some data just cannot be protected longer because you need to have it in the background. And this brings us to a pretty important topic in the end. If you want to have the passcode being used and you want to have strong passcodes set, how do we do this so that you have usability for your users? Because if they need to type in a long, strong passcode every time they want to unlock their device, that's usually not happening. Usually it's a 4-digit code. Now, since iOS 9, Apple enforces you to have 6 digits at least. But they also introduced Touch ID. And in the beginning, when it came out, the security community was like, oh, we can just lift fingerprints and unlock phones. That's probably true, but I think it's more meant to be a usability feature. And it's strong in that it encourages people to use it, because you can use Apple Pay and you can use it to pay in the App Store. You can use it to do a lot of things which people want to do, and at the same time it forces them to set a passcode on the device. So the number of people which suddenly have passcodes on the devices set because of Touch ID is probably increased quite a bit, and every one of those can actually take care or advantage of these increased storage features we just talked about. Internally, Touch ID is actually just a wrapper around the passcode. So data is still encrypted under the passcode. That's why when you turn on your iPhone the first time after it was off, it always asks you to enter the passcode first, because it then will derive the encryption key from that, and that will be stored in the secure enclave in the part for the Touch ID. And whenever you put your fingerprint on, the hardware will verify that it's your finger and unlock that key and release it so that you can decrypt data again. There's another feature which is related to the fingerprint scanner, which is pretty interesting actually. It's called user presence, and it's also been introduced in iOS 8, I believe. The idea here is that before we went from full disk encryption, where data is protected until the device has been turned on, to when the device is unlocked with the feature I talked about. And now there's a way to protect data until you actually need it. So even if you have your phone lying on the table and somebody grabs it and opens an app which is very sensitive and will try to access something, this app will need to get the data from the keychain. And if it has a certain flag set, then it will require the user to re-authenticate at that point. So at that point, only when you read the data, it will ask you, please put your finger on here, or please enter your passcode again. And only then will you get access to that. So we're getting more fine-grained control to when data is actually accessible. I want to quickly mention here, there is also a local authentication API, which is something which is an OS-level API. What I mean by that, it's not backed by hardware and it's not tied into the secure enclave directly. But it allows developers to say, I want to authenticate the user at this point. And then it will just pop up a question, say, hey, please authenticate. And the operating system will then tell the app, yes, that was authenticated or was not. The problem is, if you have a jailbroken device, you can simply bypass that. You can hook that operating system call and just tell the app, yeah, there was a right finger here. While the other protection, which actually stores data encrypted, protected by Touch ID, cannot be bypassed when you have a jailbroken device. You actually need to know the passcode or have the actual fingerprint. And that actually brings us to the what can you do when you jailbreak a device? That may be a question you may have. Jailbreaks definitely do allow you to execute unsigned code. I mentioned before that there is the boot chain verification and things which can that you cannot run code which has not been signed by Apple. But if you do jailbreak your device, you can run unsigned code, and you can bypass that mechanism and a few other OS level protections. But what you cannot do is it does not disable sandboxing for App Store apps. So everything which is downloaded from the App Store will still be sandboxed and protected. So it's not like every app can then suddenly read all the data on your file system. That's not the case. Now, what about secure storage? Well, first of all, the passcode on a device may actually prevent you from jailbreaking a device. If you have ever jailbroken anything with a public jailbreak, you know that it will always ask you to unlock the device, to reboot a few times, and you can't do that without knowing the passcode. There may be non-public jailbreaks which work without doing this, but in general, for public jailbreaks, for the majority of people being targeted by this potentially, that's probably not a too big issue. But you can also then get access to all data which is not protected by the passcode simply by reading it. But as I mentioned before, you cannot bypass data which is protected under the passcode because you need to actually unlock the key for that. Now, what are the security threats if you think about non-jailbroken devices? Well, it kind of limits it down to quite a bit. The first one is over-permissive apps, like a malicious application that's asking for permissions, and people are really conditioned to just click allow, I want to use this app now, and just going to click allow on all these prompts and pop-ups. So that's definitely one of the things, and we have seen like a lot of people falling victim to that. The other one is apps attacking apps. So the only way to really interact with an app on iOS is using URL schemes. So there is a lot of exposure to URL schemes where untrusted data is being consumed by one app and which may be called by any other app on the operating system. So there may be a malicious app you install which may attack another app via URL schemes. That's really the only way how apps can talk to each other unless you have some sort of sandbox breakout, and then you should talk to me. And finally, evil mate style attacks, of which will be really relevant for the Android section of this talk. So you could potentially jailbreak a device, backdoor it, or backdoor an app on the device, and then give it back to a user, and then you can watch what they're doing and get potentially more access to the data. And Drew will talk about Android in the next section, and he will talk about the evil mate style attacks a bit more as well.
All right, thanks. So let's look at how Android tackles some of these same problems that we just looked at on the iOS side. So we put together sort of the evolution here of Android security. The different versions are listed and sort of when these new security features were added goes along. We've highlighted the ones in blue that pertain specifically to this talk, but left the other ones just for general information. Talk quickly about a few of these. The key store hidden keys I've starred. We'll talk more in depth about that. However, force encrypt was something that Google tried to roll out with Lollipop. And this means that the normally user-electable user data encryption was forced on you, which is a kind of a win for security. Unfortunately, the OEM partners of Google were not ready for this, and so they quietly removed that requirement for Lollipop. And so let's see what happens with Marshmallow. I think they're going to try that again. But the main point is that not every device, even for sale right now, comes with the encryption on by default. It's something that you have to manually turn on yourself. So if we look at the graph of the users of Android, we can kind of look at really the fragmentation that everyone's very familiar with, and really like the complex problem that application developers have. As we can see, the majority of people on Android right now are not on the newest version. We are on a 2-year-old version of Android at this point. And I'll talk more about why that is coming up here. But if we kind of contrast that with iOS adoption, we can see that the vast majority of users are already on the latest version of the operating system, which means they have all the latest security features and bug fixes and things that Android users will have to wait years, if ever, to get pushed to their handsets, depending on the model you have. And this has a pretty serious impact on application developers because there's an immense code complexity problem in that in order to target the latest security APIs available, you have to sort of like if-def your code considerably to say, well, if we're on 4.4, we should use this facility. If we're on 4.3, you have to fall back to this. And a lot of people just default to fail to like the most simple option and like the least secure option in that case, because they want their app to run properly on all versions of the platform. And as I mentioned, access to the more secure functionality just isn't realistic for all users of Android. And this is the complicated problem of what we call OTA or over-the-air updates. And this is a talk in itself, but to paraphrase or to briefly summarize rather, updates, maybe a patch comes out today from Google for a bug, but that patch will take a long time to actually make it to your handset because the OEMs that Google partners with all like to customize Android considerably, and it's usually not the case where you can just directly apply that patch. So they have to rework it for their hacked up version of Android, And then once that's done, it has to go to the carriers, at least in the US, for the carriers to vet the build and then eventually allow the update to get pushed out. So in a lot of cases, this increases the time that you would have to get the actual update. And these carriers are in the business of selling you a new phone constantly. So there's really no pushing factor for them to want to do these updates for you, especially like years after you purchase the device. They would rather you just buy something new. So what we basically end up with at the end of this is a lot of devices that will be forever vulnerable until you purchase something new. So let's take a quick look about how the Android encryption works here. As we saw on the iOS side, we have a similar model here, and I'll briefly explain how all these work. At a very high level, Google uses AES 128 in CBC mode to encrypt each sector of the disk. There's an ESSIV SHA-256 for each sector initialization vector, and there's the concept of the device encryption key, which is generated when you enable encryption for the first time. It goes through and encrypts all the sectors with that key. The problem with having just this device key is that it's you need to have a passcode on top of that. And so what they've done to solve this issue is to have a KEK, or key encryption key. And this is actually what wraps the device encryption key that is sort of the static key, so that if you do update your passcode, you don't have to go through and re-encrypt the entire drive. So this key encryption key and an IV are stored in what we call the encrypted deck, which we'll talk about a little bit more. This is usually a crypto footer at the end of the user data partition, or on some models, it's a dedicated partition for this metadata. So similar to iOS, we have a key derivation function. It's very hard to see that screen, I'm sorry, but this is a lock screen. You can use a PIN, a pattern, or a password on Android, as you may know if you use Android. Google used PBKDF2 up until KitKat, and then they switched to scrypt to protect against brute force attacks. And we see that the password key is what generates here. And then additionally, in 5.0, Google introduced with Lollipop the ability to sign this key with hardware. And so this is a feature that is relatively new, but it basically prevents offline attacks at this point, because similar to iOS, there's a component of the cryptography that's baked into hardware that you need to actually execute on the hardware. So you can't throw a ton of RAM and things at the problem anymore to try and brute force. You have to rely on running on the actual device at this point. So when we talk about full disk encryption, it's kind of a misnomer, especially on Android, because there's a single partition out of all of the many that you have on your device that's encrypted, and that's the user data partition. And at the very end of it is the crypto footer that I mentioned. This is usually 16 kilobytes that's carved out of the end for all of the crypto metadata that's stored here. And as I mentioned, sometimes on more modern devices, there's a dedicated partition for this. And the master key is stored here, as I mentioned before. If you're familiar with LUKS, it's LUKS-like, but not quite, because the footer only has one key slot available, which is why you can't have separate boot and lock screen passwords on Android without using a custom ROM or something like that. So the Android Credential store stores like VPN keys, asymmetric keys, Wi-Fi keys, and things like that. It's encrypted by a key derived from the user's passcode. It can be hardware-backed. A lot of models these days come with hardware-backed crypto storage, which means that the private keys are non-extractable from the device, even if you've rooted your handset. And it requires the use of the device in the attack, as I mentioned. However, there's some pretty serious problems with Keystore up until Marshmallow, which came out a month ago. There's very inconsistent protections applied and available to developers who use Keystore. And Keystore really didn't become a very realistic option, in my opinion, until Android 4.3 anyway. But there's a lot of issues with developers having their keys just wiped from the device, and a lot of issues filed on Google's code base on why is this happening, and not being able to even reproduce the same steps that cause these keys to be deleted. So unfortunately, a lot of the apps we review, the feedback from the developers is, well, we can't trust the key store, so we're just going to do it ourselves. And this leads to obvious problems with trying to do secure storage outside of the platform. Luckily, with Marshmallow, they've improved this greatly. There's very clearly defined results and expectations for using the key store. And I mentioned, earlier on the slide with the secret keys that can now be stored in the key store. This was only possible before using like an undocumented API, but now it's fully supported, so you can store arbitrary application secrets in the key store as well, and not just asymmetric keys. So very quickly, we'll look at some changes that Marshmallow has brought out. As I mentioned, scrypt earlier was introduced in 4.4 for the passcode, but now we have scrypt hashing the unlocked passcode values that are stored in memory. And this replaces the weaker SHA-1 MD5 hash concatenation that they used to use. And as I mentioned, the additional key store improvements, we can store symmetric keys now, and we have additional properties for keys. So you can actually say, you can't use ECB, you cannot have a fixed IV. There's certain metadata parameters that you can enforce now with the key types. And next is imprint. Similar to Touch ID, this is relatively new, came out with the new Nexus line. A few OEMs have had a fingerprint scanner in the past, but now there's sort of a unified Android open source project version of this functionality. And sort of as Daniel mentioned, this allows for much better passwords because now you only really have to type your long, gnarly password one time when you boot, and then you can use the fingerprint unlock each time. So if you get a new email, you don't have to sit there and type like a 14-character password each time. So hopefully that improves security in the sense that it's much more usable now, and people will elect to select better passwords. And it's something you have to enroll a password with to use. So just like on iOS, as Daniel mentioned, this is a win for security. And it's used for things like secure payments, Android Pay, unlocking the phone, obviously. You can ask to re-authenticate, similar to, as Daniel mentioned. And this information is secured and stored in a trusted execution environment in hardware. So this is, again, non-extractable, even if you rooted your handset. And I think this really sets the defined standards for other OEMs to follow now. So I think this is a win in terms of security. But talking about Google and their OEM partners, this is where we start to get off the rails a little bit here. And unfortunately, and fortunately, Android is a very diverse platform that allows to run on like the most bare bones hardware possible or like the highest end flagship. But unfortunately, with that flexibility comes wildly inconsistent behavior in terms of how these things are built. The bootloader security is totally different on a lot of devices. We may or may not have hardware-backed crypto storage capabilities based on the price of the device. It may or may not have a trust zone or trusted execution environment component. And even the boot image type can't be agreed upon. We have wild differences in how even these devices boot up. And each OEM decides to protect things differently. So we have different protection schemes in play. Some OEMs like HTC will employ write protection on the eMMC. So even if you achieve root in the operating system and you try to overwrite a partition, it'll silently discard the write because it's protected at a hardware level. We also have some OEMs doing boot image signature verification, which is great, and a lot of them that do not do that, which is very bad. And we also even have different bootloader types. So we have ones that are completely locked and have no possibility of being opened unless you find an exploit for them. We have locked but unlockable, which is luckily becoming more popular. That's the Nexus model, and that's also things that HTC and Sony have developer programs that by default become locked, but there's a way to get a key to unlock that so that you can run custom firmware. And then we have permissive by default, where the OEMs just didn't care to fix this or enforce any sort of security here. But unfortunately, this is a very difficult problem to solve for Google. And it's challenging for Google to mandate certain protections on their OEM partners. And as Daniel mentioned, Apple has a very distinct advantage here in that they control the entire stack. So from top to bottom, they've designed it so that it's secure by default. On Android, it really depends on the model. And even the same model sold on different carriers in different markets may have different protections. So it's a very nuanced problem here. So let's look at the importance of boot security. So the ones in green I've highlighted as being, this is relatively secure. The bootloader has multiple chains of trust and needs to pass off to secondary bootloaders. So messing with any of these is going to cause your device to basically brick without doing some sort of low-level flash. And then we have user data if the user has chosen to actually, wow, sorry, this is very hard to read. This is bootloader. This is user data partition. We're assuming that these are secure based on like the best configurations possible. However, there's two problems in this setup. The boot image itself is vulnerable unless there is some image signing verification in the bootloader, because this is not encrypted and can be overwritten in many cases. And the system partition, which is where Android's like core OS lives, is vulnerable in the sense that it is read-only when you boot it up in the operating system, but there's no encryption protection or verification here without something like DM Verity, which is a relatively new thing that Google has rolled out with Marshmallow on the Nexus line. It remains to be seen if other OEM partners are going to pick this up. But this is important because, you know, as Daniel mentioned, all of these things are signed on iOS. This is not really the case on Android. And so let's look at some specific reasons why we can modify some of these things. And so let's talk now about download mode. So how many people here have a Samsung device? Quite a few. Okay. So as you may or may not know, Samsung ships all of their devices with a specific bootloader interface called Odin mode or download mode. And this is a special boot mode that you access by what we call the grip of death, which is multiple key presses at the same time in a certain scenario. Will boot you into this mode. Internally, Samsung uses a tool called Odin to interface with this, and this is primarily used to flash firmware images directly to partitions on the eMMC itself. Unfortunately, this is a closed source, Windows-only application, and it's also a very terrible piece of software, in my opinion. However, a guy called Ben Doble from Australia has created a product called Heimdall, which is a cross-platform open source version of this tool. So if you're interested in these things, I would definitely recommend that, because you can download it and build it yourself and run it on any platform you desire. Unfortunately for Samsung, this is a very overly permissive. If you know about this mode, and on almost all of their devices, you can directly write firmware to a device if you have physical access to it. There are some exceptions on US carriers. Specifically, Verizon and AT&T enforce boot image verification on their devices, on their network, on most of the Samsung devices they sell. But internationally and on other US carriers, this protection is not enabled unless the carrier requests it. So you have a situation where you can write firmware directly to a device. Let's look at another example. Little Kernel bootloader, which is Qualcomm's open source bootloader. There's been even many issues with this, and a lot of these stem from the fact that most of the code is open source. However, each OEM adds their own sort of secret sauce to this when they build it, and don't always do this properly. So there's a few CVEs we called out that would allow you to overwrite boot images on your device if you could. The first one, they just forgot to check whether fastboot boot had the ability to boot an image, so you could just boot an arbitrary image on the device a single time, use that to root or do whatever you want to it. The second one was a bug in the signature parsing that allowed you to spoof your own signatures so that you could sign your own boot image. And the last one's relatively new in that when you flash images, usually with fastboot and for system, they're sparse bundle images. And they didn't really check where the end of the sparse bundle was for system. So if you crafted something sneaky, you could overwrite the boundary of the system partition and potentially overwrite other parts of the device using this. And lastly, the newcomer Laugh, which is aptly titled because this is basically a hilarious backdoor on lots of LG devices that shipped. You boot into it similar to how you would boot into a download mode on a Samsung device, and then you use a single binary and provide the COM port the device is plugged into, and you're dropped into a root shell. And so from there, you can do all sorts of terrible things to a device. Flash new images, get a shell, anything you'd like. They attempted to fix this, but they didn't really do it very well in the sense that they sort of protected the specific partitions themselves and not the root device. So if you use DD and seek and cleverly write the image, you can overwrite block 0 and still overwrite the image you wanted to and take advantage of this. So let's revisit the idea that full disk encryption protects the device when it's turned off. We are suggesting that this is not always the case. And so we'd like to introduce Rosie, our evil Android evil maid. This exploits permissive bootloaders on many handsets. Basically created our own kernel image using the open source GPL version of the kernel from the OEM, installed a backdoor, and in less than 2 minutes, we can completely backdoor a device here. The idea is that you do this and give it back to the user, they enter their decryption key, and then our backdoor starts to work. So you can actually grab the key itself. You can use this for data exfiltration, anything you can dream up. So Daniel's going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of how we did this.
Sure, thanks. So the first thing, when we developed this, the first thing you need to do is to get into download mode and to flash on a custom recovery. Custom recovery just allows us to boot into like a secure, not a secure, but in like an environment which will not be able to destroy when we're flashing failed flash attempts at our main operating system. So it's just like a small little OS you can boot into, and you can perform like debugging and flashing of code over there. So that's the first thing we did. And then as a second step, we developed our kernel. I don't know if you can read this here, but we added a kernel backdoor just simply by downloading the open source kernel version, which is available for all devices because of the licensing. Just download the open source version, add a custom kernel module, which we wrote ourselves, add it to the kernel, compile it, and then after we had that, we'd simply have to test it. So we compiled it, created a boot image from that and booted into the recovery, flashed it on there, tried it out, and rinse and repeat until we found that everything was working. Now, once this is all done, the only thing we need to do though is flash the new image which we have. So the next slide will show you a video demo of this, and I hope the screen will show this properly, where we walk you through what's happening there. Should we play?
Cool. Yeah. So this is on just to illustrate that the device is working here. We're turning it off. And a little shot clock counter will start in the bottom of when the device is fully off until the time it's actually fully backdoored. So here you can see me entering the permissive bootloader here and saying a custom OS may cause issues, no doubt. Daniel here is loading our boot image into the flashing tool. We click flash, and very quickly we can see it turns green on the top, and now we're done. So that device is backdoored at this point. And we're rebooting the device, and Daniel will talk about what happens after that.
Yeah, so the little proof of concept we built is just shipping off a certain file to a cloud provider. So we just have a Netcat listener running somewhere on a cloud instance on a certain port, and then we wait until the user enters their credentials and the device is unlocked, and then we just ship the file off to our server just to copy it. So it's on the right side, which you can't really see, is a terminal listening on the server, and the left side is the device. It's going to take a few seconds. Crypto is slow. There we go. So I don't know if you could see this, but there's like a hex dump which arrived over here. And then, which you probably can't read because the contrast is so poor. We are opening it up. It's a SQLite database of the accounts file, I believe, which is usually not accessible to a regular user. We just ADB into the device after this to show you. Yeah. So if you just do ADB shell and you try to access that file, you will get an access denied. So it's definitely a file which is not accessible to the regular user. And the device is not rooted. There is no root on this device. It's just our backdoor running, and it's running in the kernel, so it's running with like elevated privileges and can grab whatever it wants. So where does it leave us? Well, this is possible on a number of OEMs. This is not specific to the device we've shown. anything which allows us to flash things, like all the vulnerabilities Drew has been talking about, for all of those devices, you can do this. And it kind of puts a new picture on like when my device is off and nobody can do something to it. Well, if you leave it out of sight, somebody may actually be able to backdoor it and then have a permanent foothold on your device because there's no bootstrap verification on a lot of these devices. This is obviously not a new problem. People have been using this to flash custom firmware on their devices for quite a while. And that's also a reason why this may be a desired feature. And Drew has some opinions on that. And then now if you look at Marshmallow and other things, there's definitely a mechanism to prevent this. First of all, there is a way to verify the boot chain if you choose to. And also, since Marshmallow, Google is now mandating that OEMs are requiring an opt-in to have this feature. So you need to boot into the device, unlock it with your passcode if you have one, and then say, I want to allow the flashing of firmware or foreign images, and only then you can do that. So till when we're all finally at Marshmallow, which will clearly not happen in quite a while, that may not be an issue anymore. And as I've hinted at similar attacks are possible on iOS, but they obviously require jailbreaking, which may be equally tricky because you may need to have the passcode for that.
All right. So this is the slide we call Drew's soapbox here. I think by default, we want to see secured configurations. I want to see that these bootloaders are locked by default, and not just locked, but have a responsible unlock capability. Because one of the best things about Android, and the reason I got into security to begin with, is because of hacking on Android and learning how things worked. I wouldn't be able to do that if my bootloader was locked. And I don't want to run dangerous exploits to have to do that I don't know what they're doing to my device. So in addition to having secure by default, we should have a responsible unlock. And I think clearly documented security guarantees from OEMs would be very helpful, because as we mentioned, you really don't know when you're purchasing a device like what protections it has, because they're so vastly different. And even the model we showed in the demo, there's like 5 or 6 variants of that device which each have different protections applied to it. So it's not even like you could go by a sales name. You really have to know what to look for, and that shouldn't be the case, we don't think. And lastly, just consistency among Google's OEM partners. Let's decide on one secure bootloader configuration that everyone acknowledges and hacks on and uses, and not have this wild nest of weird different variations that we have right now. So let's look at, real quickly, a couple alternatives to platform security. If you don't trust either Google or Apple here, what can we do?
Yeah, this just very briefly. What do you do when you don't have passcodes on the device? In either case, on iOS or Android, well, what most applications do, if you think of Good or any other mobile iron or software like this, what they do, they build their own custom sandboxes for their data, and they use the same mechanism which the operating system uses. They ask for a passcode, they derive a key from the passcode, and then they use that to encrypt the data on the device, which is the same process as before. If you close the app, they will wipe the key, and you have similar process to what the operating system provides. The main problem is, number one, crypto is hard, so it's really hard to get this right and to not make any mistakes implementing these kind of things. And then the second one is that there's no hardware backing or brute force protections in this case, because there's nothing which ties it to the device. You may be able to integrate like an online step where the app is talking to a server and needs a server part, and then you can build something like this. But if you need offline access to the data, then it's really almost impossible to build proper brute force protections for this. You could also just consider not storing data offline, but that's obviously also very difficult. If it's highly sensitive data, just fall back to the old paradigm to just pull data on demand and don't store it on the device. But at least login credentials will probably still be stored, because otherwise users will need to log in every single time. And unless it's maybe a banking app or something which people care about a lot, this will not be acceptable. So where does this leave us? Well, we think for developers and for users, we will talk about some best practices here. Obviously, the passcode is for users a really important factor, since it ties into so many parts of the ecosystem, and it ties into how encryption works and when data is protected and when it is not. For iOS, it may be desirable for you to enable wiping of the device so that somebody can on-device brute force things, so that either your device gets wiped or that you can remotely wipe a device. And on Android, Drew will have some features there.
Yeah, and sort of as I mentioned, choose your phone wisely. This is something that unfortunately right now is very much something you have to research yourself and figure out what the best device is and what the most secure device is for whatever needs you have for data storage. And as I mentioned, User data encryption is an electable feature still at this point. So encrypt your device, take the extra step, enable it. Even though we've shown how sometimes you can get around that, you're still protecting yourself in a way that is reasonable. And for developers, in general, as we mentioned, determine if you really have to store this data locally. Obviously, this is a case-by-case situation, which a blanket statement is not great for, but something to think about if you're developing an application. Do I really have to store this, or can I just pull this each time I need it? On Android, I think that we've shown that relying on platform security can be challenging because of the various different versions of Android out there and all the different protections they have. And sort of a discussion point for afterwards is at what point do we stop supporting old versions of Android as developers, or as software developers? Is there a point where we say it's not worth the security risk for the app?
Yeah, on the iOS side, obviously, you also use some protection class that incorporates the passcode when storing data, sensitive data at least, on the file system or in the keychain. And now that you can test whether there's a passcode set using some of the newer APIs, either warn the user that their data is not secure to store it, or refuse to store it, or do something that the user at least have some insight into what they're doing to themselves if they store data like that. So looking forward, the road ahead, what we think is some of the next things which we definitely should tackle. We've seen that we need something beyond passwords. The whole Touch ID and the new Nexus features are definitely a right step in the right direction to make usability easier, and at the same time improve security, because we're encouraging people to use security features. But then on the developer side, we need some more consistencies, and that's probably more of an Android thing than it is an iOS thing. But even the iOS documentations and all these things are hard to follow, and it's very difficult to figure out what protections which of these things are actually giving you. And on the Android side, there's vastly different inconsistencies between platforms and default settings, which are not very sane. So maybe helpful to improve those.
So our takeaways we hope you got from the presentation. Security controls should be balanced with data sensitivity and the threat model you're worried about. Protecting data until access is actually needed. And lastly, secure storage relies on the entire stack being secured, not just one small part of it, as we've demonstrated here in the demo. So here's some references for you to read up on some of the bugs that we've talked about, or some of the tools we've used. And thanks, everyone. This is Twitter information, and the slide deck should be available here in probably 20 minutes or so afterwards. So
thanks.
Thanks. So, any questions? Yes.
I have one. So first of all, thanks for the excellent talk.
You're welcome.
Getting back to fingerprint authentication for a second. Since you put your finger on, this gives you access to the key derived from the passcode.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it must be stored somewhere, right?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
In that case, it is.
Is it kept in main memory?
So I don't know about your side.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So the question was, with the fingerprint scanners, where is this actually stored on the device? I'll let Daniel talk about iOS, and I'll talk about Android.
Okay. So on the iOS side, it's stored in the secure enclave, in the component which is not accessible from the main processor directly. So when you unlock the device the first time, after you boot it up, it will derive the key and store it, and then it will be protected by the Touch ID. So when you put the fingerprint on, it will release the key outside of the secure enclave, or for the secure enclave to be used to decrypt things. So it's stored in the secure part of the CPU, let's put it that way. You can't get it off. It's just like the operating system. I mean, for all we know, we can't get it off. The operating system will just tell it, please use this key to decrypt this data, and it will decrypt it, but you can't actually get the key to do something with it.
And similar on the Nexus imprint stuff, at least for the latest Nexus devices that have come out, this is all backed by a trusted execution environment or trust zone sort of component. So similar to how Apple handles this, it's in hardware and it's non-extractable even as root from the platform. So at least right now, that's the guarantee we have on it. Yes.
So the passcode and the touch ID are pretty much interchangeable, right? Because it caches the result, the right password from the passcode, and when you put your finger on it, it pretty much releases that.
Yep.
Is there any way outside of the local API, which is spoofable, any way to actually make sure that the user is putting the finger, and at that point the finger matches the stored one, and so on and so on?
Yes. Actually, since iOS 9, there is. So the local authentication API used to have that, right? That you can say it has to be the fingerprint or it has to be the passcode. And now the keychain access controls now have a feature where you can require one or the other. But that's only in the latest version now. So you can say when you read something on the keychain and you require user authentication at that point that you put your finger on, or you type in the passcode, you can say that you want the finger.
And it will only release the information from the keychain if the finger was there.
Yeah.
And that's quote-unquote kernel thingy. And
it's actually it's secure enclave thingy, so it's beyond the operating system. Yeah.
Sure. Yep.
In conjunction with that one, so I'm sure my fingerprint, for example, is on my device, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Are the attacks still possible to grab a rubber finger or something like that?
Yeah.
So that's still the main attack, right?
But it's a physical attack where you need somebody they need to target you specifically and come to you and lift your fingerprint. It's not like somebody can just grab your phone and run away and do something with it. So depends what you're concerned about. If you're concerned about that somebody is specifically targeting you and wants to get to your phone, yeah, they can do that. But if you just want to protect against somebody stealing your phone and not being that sophisticated to actually follow you and lift a fingerprint, then it's probably better than having no passcode on the device. But yeah, I agree. And it's not the fingerprint itself which is stored. There is minutia data, they call that, which is some data derived from your fingerprint, and you can't reconstruct the fingerprint from that data. It's kind of like, it's not really a hash, but it has the same property that you can't reverse it basically.
Yeah, and just on that point, Google actually calls that out as a risk of using the new Nexus imprint, is that it may be possible to recover fingerprints. So it's definitely something that if someone's attacking you specifically, then yeah, that's possible.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, cool. Thank you guys. Feel free to come up later.